Did you know that there's a large percentage of the population whose average lifespan is 20 years shorter than everyone else's? It's true, and it's not affected by social status or race or even weight. It affects every people group, every neighborhood, every wealth class. So you want to find out whether you're in that group or not? Stay tuned because that's what we're going to be discussing today. If you're new to the channel or having joined this awesome community all about emotional and financial well-being, do that now before we get started. Just click the little red subscribe button and the bell beside it to be notified every time we release a new video. This video is not intended to replace the advice of your allopathic physician. Please consult with your GP if you have serious symptoms, illness, or disease. Have you ever heard of a person dying before their time in their 30s, 40s, 50s, or even earlier, especially of a health-related cause? Well, it's not a coincidence. Health-related deaths are not random. They're linked very closely to the type of relationships and environments that that person grew up with, but also closely connected to the emotional states and behaviors that that person had, and the social support system that they surrounded themselves with leading up to their untimely death. So the question I want to answer today is, are we turning emotional problems into body problems? Hopefully by the end of the video, there will be a clear answer, or at least a curiosity that provokes deeper investigation. Dr. Gabor Mate says that anything that's happening emotionally will also show up physiologically, and a physiological response can be anything from a benign skin condition to end-stage cancer or heart disease. Physiological responses can stay under the radar for a long time, even decades, until they become more advanced or pronounced. So why is that? Well, we humans are pretty good at ignoring pain and discomfort in the body because most of us are disconnected with our inner signals. And a lot of the times that started in childhood as a survival adaptation. So we're going to talk more about that later in the video. But be assured, if a person is experiencing stress or unrest emotionally, the body is responding physiologically. And sometimes this is seen as early as infancy in the form of a gastro or a skin condition, or in childhood as headaches or stomach aches. There have even been studies that link colic in high-stress environments. But regardless of the age we are when we become aware that our bodies are showing signs of emotional unrest, it's still happening. Even inflammation is a physiological response. A person can have inflammation for years and not even realize it until it causes another condition. Medically speaking, it's well known that inflammation causes diseases. But the point of this video and many of my others is that we need to be focusing on what's causing the inflammation and other physiological responses on an emotional level. Because our emotional states don't just affect physiology, but all aspects of life. Sometimes, while not ideal, disease can become our greatest teacher because it forces us to look at our lives from a new perspective and become aware of the pain and trauma that is often hiding deep inside. The biggest pushback I get when discussing this topic is that illnesses are inherited or genetic. But the truth is, science has shown that genes predetermining whether a person will get a disease or not are in fact very, very rare. Genes are the determining factor in only 1 of every 10,000 cases, and this has been brought to light with the recent discovery of epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study that shows that genes are switched on or off according to the environment that an infant is raised in, and this includes the 9 months in vitro. This incredible study has evidenced the fact that the environment in which a person is raised has 95% to do with future dis-ease, including physical disease. We can look at breast cancer, for example. Just like with other diseases, gene mutations known to increase the risk of breast cancer are rare in the general population. If you look at 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 of them have the gene, and not every woman who has the gene even gets breast cancer. If a family member of yours had breast cancer and now you have breast cancer, it doesn't necessarily mean you have the gene because, again, those are incredibly rare. So these studies and more have led to the discovery that there's a different explanation for transgenerational diseases. Just because a disease runs in a family does not mean it's genetic. Psychological stress is also passed along through families. According to epigenetics, psychological stress is what turns a gene on. So without the psychological stress, a person with that same gene won't get the illness. So the genetic argument is a shaky one and cannot be relied on scientifically because there are too many inconsistencies. Besides that, there's little point in focusing on genes as a cause of illness because it leaves us at a dead end when it comes to finding a solution. Let's say that you are told that you have a gene predisposing you to a particular illness. Well, guess what? you're going to have this tendency to adopt a deep-seated belief and acceptance that I'm just doomed to get this illness. You don't have to be a strong believer in law of attraction or manifestation to know that's not a good idea to have a deep-seated belief that you're going to get sick. The mind-body connection is far too powerful for that to be a safe practice. Instead of focusing on genetic tendencies, we need to look at what can be repaired or changed. Two of those things are the relationships and environments you were in as a child and the environments and relationships you choose to be in now as an adult. Just these two factors alone have more influence on whether you will become sick or stay sick than anything else in life. They're also two of the greatest factors when it comes to longevity. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that statistically speaking, a person with significant ACEs, 4 or higher, dies an average of 20 years earlier than someone who doesn't have any ACEs. And if you haven't gotten your ACE score yet, I'm going to put a link in the description at the end of the video so you can take the test and find out what it is. Because honestly, it's one of the first steps toward awareness that's super easy to take. The test takes 2 minutes and it's free. If you have time, I recommend also taking the childhood emotional neglect test as well, because it's invaluable to understand that what you went through as a child has everything to do with the life that you now have. And like I always say, we can't fix a problem unless we know what it is. I understand it can feel easier to focus on diet or lack of exercise or bacteria as the cause of disease and illnesses instead of the true cause, which is the disunity between mind and body. Because it forces us to investigate adverse experiences that we had at a tender age, things many of us would just rather not think about ever again. The problem is that when we choose not to think about it, we continue to suppress very important parts of ourselves. And I'm not trying to imply that facing old issues is easy, just that it's necessary for growth and healing. It takes compassion to feel safe enough to do this. When compassion is present, it allows us to be able to see the truth. Sometimes we can find that compassion in another person, like a therapist, but oftentimes we have to be that compassion for ourselves. So compassion is not about protecting ourselves from pain, but allowing ourselves to see the truth. If you were just to focus on repairing the damage done by the relationships and environments you were in as a child, and removing yourself or at least modifying the toxic relationships and environments you find yourself in today, just those two actions alone could change the course of your life forever. Studies have shown that staying in a highly stressful emotional state leads to chronic cortisol release. And chronic cortisol release leads to things like diabetes, lower immune system function, heart disease, cancer, ulcerations of the intestines, and so on. In many cases, cortisol release becomes exhausted, meaning it runs low, which leads to things like autoimmune disease and osteoporosis. An example I've often heard Dr. Mate reference to highlight this is high blood pressure. Dr. Mate is an MD with 35 years experience, and he says very few cases of high blood pressure are genetic. Even if other family members had high blood pressure, very rarely is there a genetic link. Even just the medical term for high blood pressure gives hints to what causes it. It's called hypertension. Hypertension. If you struggle with high blood pressure, could it be that there's a lot of stress in your relationships and environments? Perhaps there's been a lot of tension in your life since the very beginning. Maybe your mom had a lot of tension from the time that you were conceived. Addressing high blood pressure from an emotional standpoint gives you a chance of recovery as opposed to just maintenance, which is the only thing that allopathic medicine is able to provide us at this point. And that's because traditional medical training is currently limited to just treating the physical body and its symptoms. Chronic fatigue is another example of a physiological response. It's like the body just says no. So why does the body need to say no? Probably because the person with chronic fatigue hasn't been able to say no to things in his or her life. Possibly carrying too much stress or taking on too much responsibility from other people. And often that's just because taking care of people is a coping mechanism, a way of being liked and feeling a sense of purpose in the world. People who know that person would likely describe him or her as being selfless and caring. Unfortunately, one of the risk factors of illness is having a compulsive and rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility. When a person isn't authentic with herself, she doesn't know it's okay to say no or when to say no. So eventually, the body says no for her in the form of illness or disease. And that's why I said earlier, disease and illness can be our greatest teacher, letting us know something isn't okay here. So how does a person get to that point? Well, by the time that we reach adolescence, our stress responses and hormonal reactions, and neurological set points, and cardiological states are pretty much pre-programmed, which define how the body responds. And this is really important to understand because early life stress and unresolved trauma are the #1 underexposed risk factors for all complex chronic illnesses today, leading to 7 out of 10 leading causes of death and a 20-year reduction in lifespan, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It also leads to a 600% increased risk of diseases like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, and a 200% increase in the chances of getting autoimmune disease, and a 400% chance of mental health disorders, dementia, Alzheimer's, depression, and anxiety. It's also the #1 cause of all addiction, which we're going to be talking more about in next week's video, so make sure your notifications are turned on so you don't miss it. Despite the research, most physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists haven't made the link between adult problems and childhood trauma. And even as a society, we tend to separate the mind from the body, which is an erroneous way of thinking. We also separate the person from the environment they're in. What's considered normal in this society is highly dysfunctional, and abnormalities are actually normal responses to an unhealthy social ethic. Even some of the leaders in our society are highly traumatized people who are compensating through their public activity for their internal emptiness. Believe it or not, the more idyllic or perfect a person's life appears, the greater the likelihood of dysfunction because they have this need to project perfection to cover up the dysfunction. So since adaptations in childhood lead to pathology and chronic illness, we need to ask ourselves, what did I learn to do in childhood to protect myself or survive that is no longer serving me and maybe even harming me? Early childhood trauma leaves a biochemical, neurological, and energetic imprint. It affects our hormones and neurotransmitters, our gut health, our immune system, our epigenetics, our detoxification system, and our cell danger response system. At some point, a critical breaker is switched off, and the child is literally marinating in stress hormones like cortisol and inflammatory cytokines from a young age, which lowers the threshold response to stressors. And one of the things that can result in is autoimmune disease. It's also associated with widespread differences in the gene expressions across the genome. Genes involved in biological processes relevant to psychiatric and substance use disorders, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, respiratory disease, and strokes. The other important factor to consider when it comes to longevity and health is the link between wellness and social support, as well as the link between loneliness and disease. In the past 15 years, several studies have been done that highlight this reality. In 2004, a landmark study was done with over 300,000 participants, which showed that having a healthy support system had more to do with longevity than any other risk factor. And in 2015, Brigham Young did a study linking loneliness and disease. Believe it or not, these studies and others like it have found that a strong social support system are stronger predictors of survival than air pollution or smoking 16 cigarettes a day or body mass index or physical exercise or alcohol consumption or even hypertension. The body can't be separated from the mind, and the person can't be separated from the environment, and this includes interpersonal relationships or lack thereof. So then what are the solutions? How do we fix this? I've done several videos on the topics of awareness and recovery, so I'll be linking those at the end of the video in the description, but basically emotional dis-ease or distress is the #1 cause of almost all illness and disease. We will continue to act out pain from the past until it's addressed and healed, and this includes the physical body. I recommend starting with the recovery series I did recently, but also make sure to watch the videos that explain what adverse childhood experiences are. And again, take the free ACE test available in the description because it's the easiest way to get a quick snapshot of how things from the past might be affecting you today. If you find out you have an ACE score of 4 or higher, that's considered a significant ACE score, and all the statistics that I mentioned earlier in the video apply. And then the childhood emotional neglect test helps you recognize whether or not you experienced that particular ACE because oftentimes it's harder to recognize emotional neglect. Right now, emotional neglect only counts as 1 point on the official ACE test, but I think as the years go by and the trauma therapy community does more research, the importance of emotional neglect is going to skyrocket. For one thing, attachment disorders fall under that category. An attachment disorder is in my opinion, the #1 cause of everything that we've talked about today. I know we covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully you found the information useful. And if you did, please help others find it by giving the video a like and putting a big yes in the comments so that I know that you connected with what I talked about. Also feel free to ask questions there, especially if I left something hanging or I didn't fully explain something. I'd also love to connect with you on social media, so feel free to leave a comment or send a message to my Facebook page, Leah Theobald. I'll put the link in the description so it's easier to find. I'm also going to be putting links to resources in the description, so that way if you want to get started with recovery today, you can. In the next video, we're going to be talking about addiction and what causes it, because I think there's so much misunderstanding in our world, and we tend to look at people with addiction as being bad people, when really, addiction is just a coping mechanism for pain. So make sure you're subscribed and that your notifications are turned on so that you don't miss it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.